everyone. Welcome to our webinar number 14. Here we are again. And just to remind you, we are still doing the mini-series around the sexual exploitation bill that was heard at the Westminster Parliament in December of 2020. So that bill was introduced by Dame Diana Johnson MP, and we developed a series of webinars around it. So we have already told you what 10-minute bills are. We talked about the specific bill that Dame Diana Johnson introduced. We told you a little about the background of that bill. And today we are going to be talking about why criminalising our clients is wrong.
So, the Nordic model, and as we've covered a little bit before, that can go through a number of different names. Sometimes people call it things like the equality model or Swedish model or end demand. There's a whole bunch of different names for it, but the Nordic model, as we're going to refer to it for this presentation, it has some aims that it puts out. These are sort of the manifest aims. These are the aims that it tells people that it gets up to. And it's about trying often to use the term decriminalisation, which is kind of a sex worker supported term, but it says it tries to use that when talking just about sex workers doing their work. So you'll see the full decriminalisation of those who are prostituted. That's kind of trying to sort of co-opt some of the language that sex workers use when sex workers try and talk about decriminalising the sale and the purchase of sex. However, they kind of separate it into one half. They also talk about high quality services for those in prostitution, but we have seen very little evidence that are actually backing up some of these claims. Similarly, there's focuses on tackling larger issues with sexual trafficking and all factors that drive people into prostitution. However, very little work actually seems to come from these groups in these particular aims. There's a lot more focus on targeting the laws around sex work and trying to make it a criminal offence to be able to buy sex work, to buy sexual services. There's a whole bunch of unofficial aims that go on behind the scenes with this. So the different groups that are involved with the Nordic model have slightly different outcomes from all of this with these aims. So, for example, some of the radical feminist groups that isolate and try to remove sex workers, they're doing that because they believe that if they experiment with this, then there's going to be an impact on sexism generally in society. And so it's kind of this movement towards prohibition to see whether sexism in other parts of life becomes an easier challenge. The sex worker groups obviously resist this and say that regardless of what type of work someone is in, we should be, sexism regardless. It should be something that it isn't sort of dependent on whether someone's doing the right type of work type thing in people's eyes. The fundamentalists they can bring in other elements like whether sex without marriage is regarded as a sin or not, and so feeling like maybe there's pressures there to sort of be shepherding people into certain behaviours, or maybe promoting conversions to a different faith group. So that could be those group focuses as well. But also there's a few other sort of more subtle things that try to get packaged in with the Nordic model. So it can be normalising that there's no separation between sex workers and people that are trafficked or perhaps doing it against their will in a sort of way that they've been forced into the work. That sort of normalization of no separation between the two groups can mean that it's easier to use legislation designed for things like people trafficking against sex workers. And again, sex workers would quite clearly distinguish the two groups and say, actually, it's important that we make these distinctions so that people can be supported in wherever they are in either scenario. There's also this normalization of trying to separate, trying to not separate clients and people that are abusive towards sex workers, whereas sex workers would say someone who is abusive to a sex worker, maybe they're someone who took money or harmed a sex worker in some way, they're not actually being a client. They're being someone that hasn't sort of met the terms of the arrangement which has been agreed. So these are the sort of differences that are happening with the model at the moment, some of the aims. When we look at the evidence that comes from where the Nordic model is in place, you see, if you look at some of the data on screen, that it's largely not stood up for its aims as far as reducing harm against sex workers, and there's very little about actually people like being involved with sex work and the numbers involved with it. A lot of the increase in violence towards sex workers can be largely to do with the fact that in order to sex work, sex workers will try and meet the needs and the sort of like privacy fears of the client. So if the client is afraid of being arrested, then it might be that the sex worker, rather than standing by the side of a car and talking to them and trying to vet to see whether they're safe or not, will get into the car quicker to make sure that the client feels more comfortable and that they're then able to do the work. So actually, a lot of the time, this sort of push on clients means that the sex worker is the one who's having to make compromises in their safety in order to still maintain getting the work. There's also this focus on, if you make the clients be the person that the police are focusing on arresting, it's still easier for the police to target a sex worker because the clients arrive with the sex worker. So the police still come to the sex worker because their aim is, even if it's not always as true as they say it is, even if their aim is to try and arrest clients. And in the places where we see it, we'll see that in many countries, it's still sex workers that are the ones that are really suffering the most. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in just a second. But you've got to also think that if the people around the sex workers are the people that are being threatened with arrest, then it can mean when someone needs to get help, they're less comfortable doing that for the sex worker. So if someone is a flatmate or a partner or something like that, perhaps they're less likely to feel like they can get support for someone if they're in because they're worried about being arrested. So let's have a look at some of the other health impacts from the Nordic model. So in some situations, it's quite clear, like HIV rates being 7 times higher when there's laws criminalising sex workers. And as you can see some of the data on there. Also, we'll see that in places like Northern Ireland, there was a very high number of arrests of the sex workers as opposed to quite a low number with the actual clients. So even the goals weren't really weren't met by actually backing up the data. You see that the demand hasn't had like a radical reduction. And in places where the Nordic model is in effect, such as Norway, there's actually been a focus to try and make sex workers homeless. So if a sex worker is found, then the practice is to talk to the landlord and to then try and attack the landlord with laws to try and make sure that they evict the sex worker. This sort of placing of sex workers into homelessness is a real extra vulnerability that they're experiencing. So these can be some of the extra reasons why there's dangers in this. Just before we move on, I should also mention that the majority of sex workers who've suffered under this have been migrant sex workers, and a lot of the time the community of sex workers say that it's a thin veil, again, regarding things like racism and treatment of migrant sex workers. So I'm going to hand over.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's it. That's our webinar for today. As always, the NUM casework team is available to you between 9 and 5. The number and the email are on screen if you need to access them. If you need a food voucher of £25, you can ask them for that as well. We are still running those and we will continue to do so. We also have a brand new online live chat if you are uncomfortable on the phone or on emails. That is also available to you. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.